Hello, and welcome to the Bozeman Beat, the City of Bozeman's podcast where we have real conversations about issues our city cares about. I'm Mayor Joey Morrison, the host of this podcast, and I'm chatting with people across the community to shed light on things the city is involved in and things we may not be that are still important to our residents. Today, we're taking a deep dive into housing affordability, a topic we touched on an earlier episode. However, today we have a new guest. We have on the show today Jason Sakran, Executive Director of Habitat for Humanity Gallatin Valley, to talk about some of the things they have been thinking about as we see things like school levies passing in Bozeman but failing in Belgrade. Having a safe and affordable place to live impacts so many facets of our lives, and so we'll hear more about that and what the wider community is doing around housing. Jason, welcome to the show today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and we're trying out a question we want folks to start with, which is, what is your favorite thing about Bozeman?
Well, let me just say, Mayor, it's a pleasure to be here. I had a great conversation with the staff prior. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So first thing that I love about Bozeman, or the biggest thing, is really just the sense of community. I came from a place that was much larger, been here about 2 years. I was from Charleston, South Carolina, came here, and it was just immediately gobsmacked by the sense of community and focus around issues. So, and of course, the natural environment, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But just the sense of community here is really, it resonates, and you could feel it, you could sense it.
Yeah, I think it's funny whenever folks visit for conferences or for a training here from the East Coast or from the West Coast, and they're like, why is everybody smiling at me when I'm walking down Main Street? Why do people wave and say hi to me when I'm walking on Pete's Hill? Like, what's going on here? And I'm just like, it's just the way it is over here.
Bozeman.
Is there anything else that you want to share about your background with either your career or with Habitat, or do you just want to get right into it?
Just quickly, I'm having a unique background. I was an elected official like yourself for 4 years.
Sorry to hear that.
I often tell people I'm a recovering politician. I love that 4 years of service, and I just want to say thanks to you for dedicating your time to public service. We don't do that enough and have that conversation. The other thing is I worked in our public school system back in South Carolina for 15 years, and I'm also a small business owner. Started a restaurant concept in Charleston. We've got 3 locations there. So the purpose of that is I've got a unique background and experience and see where housing affordability kind of intersects along the continuum with workforce, with the economy, with education, and that's really, hopefully, we can get a launching point and talk about that today.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into just, before we start getting into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, can you just give our audience, some background? What does Habitat for Humanity do? What's their model? Where is the niche that y'all fit in? Because I think everybody has some level of concept. They hear about it in passing, but they maybe don't know all the nuts and bolts.
Great question. So Habitat here in the Gallatin Valley has been around since 91. Since 91, we have built about 94 homes for working class families here in Montana. And we've also what we call critical restored homes. So we might add a roof, fix some windows, build a handicap ramp for folks. We've done about 60 of those projects over those years. But we are a national nonprofit that many have heard about. Mm-hmm. Our lane here in Bozeman is really working class families, teachers, firefighters, police officers, city staff workers, nonprofit workers, folks in the trades, HVAC, folks that are working on construction. It's that 70 to 80% AMI. That's kind of our lane, and that kind of is the project we've got coming up in West Post and Belgrade. We're going to be breaking ground with 8 homes, 2 of those homes starting this summer. And those are going to be geared specifically focused on that 70 to 8% AMI, which is your hardworking Montana families.
Yeah, I think those are the types of things I'm excited for us to dive into today is, how do we get those things to pencil out? How do we get them off the ground? Because we know that there's a gap. Maybe a little bit more context for our listeners, and I can share some of my experience as well. But we're both members of the Regional Housing Coalition. Yeah. It's a unique space. It's really cross-sector. I mean, I think it's, we've got lenders, we've got builders, we've got architects, we've got developers, we've got service providers, we've got city government, county government from not just Bozeman, but throughout the valley. Can you sort of give your take on why it comes to be. Why do you carve out time out of your schedule to commit to this group?
Great question. This is a good conversation. I'm a new member of the coalition. I know Habitat was a member, and we dropped off for a little bit, but I've been coming to the meetings for the past couple months. That's where I met you for the first time. It's new to me. It's my understanding from just speaking to members and hearing from folks that the coalition really helps create alignment around data, policy, funding opportunities, and community priorities. From the time I was there at that meeting, it seems like it serves as a forum where organizations can share ideas, identify gaps, and kind of work toward common goals. So in that regard, I think it's a great group. To your point, it's made up of folks on all sides of the continuum, folks that are involved in the funding, developers, contractors, and then folks like Habitat. So you've got community members such as that. In full disclosure, I've had conversations with some other members after my first meeting, and one of the questions I asked is, why aren't we advocating more? And I think part of that challenge is because it's such a diverse group, it's tough to land on a specific policy issue to advocate for, which is personally a challenge for me. But that's one of the limitations of the coalition. But at the same time, it does bring a diverse group of people at the table to help solve some of these issues and create some sort of alignment.
Yeah, I appreciate your naming that piece because it feels at times we may long for a moment where we're all in a little rowboat together, and if we want, we can just kind of pivot and turn direction. But the Regional Housing Coalition, with such a big group, it's a little bit of a bigger boat, so it's a little harder to turn at times. And bringing everybody together who might have restrictions of even whether they can do advocacy at all, take a position on anything. Has been, I don't envy Mark Bond's job of wrangling that crew together, but it's important.
One of the things I will say, having come from a larger city, we didn't necessarily have this infrastructure in place, this type of coalition. So I do think kudos to Gallatin, to the Valley, kudos to Bozeman for leading that charge. Kudos to, I believe it's HRDC or One Valley that
One Valley,
for really leading that effort to get this coordinated. I do think it's a net positive for the community. I just wanted to articulate one of the limitations that I saw, but I think it's a great asset for the community.
Yeah, and it's really a reminder that we sharpen our understanding of the problem and what the levers are when we bring folks together, and we can cut out some conflict when we invite everyone in early. Because I think it's interesting sitting down in the quarterly meetings because there's a pretty wide range of people that are there. Like it feels unique to have a space where realtors are sitting down with, shelter operators sitting down next to city leadership with, city of Belgrade. Right. It's a real kind of who's who of who's trying to, move and shake in the housing arena here. So I understand one of the things you wanted to talk about today is the relationship between education, housing. We are seeing these sort of tale of two different communities as school levies continue to fail in Belgrade, continue to pass in Bozeman, and trying to make sense of what's the cost of that, what are voters, what's the constituency seeing, and I'm kind of curious just what's Habitat, what's your stake in this world.
So for us, we are obviously a nonprofit that serves the entire valley, so that includes areas outside of Bozeman. So that does include places like Belgrade. The reason I wanted to mention this is, I spent 15 years working in public education, and I've seen how policy decisions or lack of direction around policy decisions kind of cascade down. So when you look at the recent school levies in Bozeman and Belgrade, what we're really seeing is more than just opinions about education. In my opinion, we're kind of getting a glimpse into how people feel about their future, kind of their economic security, and their connection to the broader community. I think education, particularly, here, I think a lot of times when you look at housing, it's like one of the strongest predicators of educational outcomes. So, for example, when children are constantly moving or don't have a stable place to live, oftentimes that reflects on their educational experience. So there is a direct connection. I'll share a quick story. My son plays soccer for Surf, which is a local group here that does like travel. And we were out in Missoula a couple weeks ago and talking to some parents, and one of the parents there is a Belgrade parent, and they were talking about. I wasn't involved in the conversation, but I overheard it. But then I interjected myself into the conversation. They were talking about the levies that failed in Belgrade. These parents are probably in their 30s and 40s, all have kids in the school system. And I really found it interesting and almost astonishing as I was listening to the conversation that they were fully supportive of the levy, and they were almost surprised that it didn't pass. I then asked one of the moms, why do you think it didn't pass? And she shared some input, but long story short, they were very supportive of the need for that type of investment in public education in Belgrade, and got the disconnect. Then asked me where I lived, and I told them I lived in Bozeman and ours passed, and that was a whole separate conversation. But I'm just using that as an illustrated point that there are folks in Belgrade, parents that really do care and really want to get involved, much like our Bozeman parents. So,
yeah, I'm curious how that conversation went with this parent, this Belgrade parent, right? Because I think I was just actually reading about this morning, so it's fresh on my mind, that we as Americans generally are more skeptical, less trusting of institutions writ large.
yeah.
Like more so since I think it was saying 1952 was the last time we were this distrustful. And it's not just government, it's big conglomerates, big business, the courts, the school system, federal government, state government, et cetera. And I'm always trying to see whenever something fails that it's clearly there's benefits for that community, but they decide, nope, we don't want it. It's often feels like under the hood is not they don't want it, they don't think it's a good thing. It's that they don't trust that the outcome is going to happen or that's feasible.
I think the parents that I spoke with, and it was the one woman that I ended up connecting with, but then I got brought into the bigger conversation with the other parents. They suspected it was a generational piece, that some of the older folks in the community didn't see the direct connection between supporting the public school system and how that affects the other parts of the community because they didn't have kids in schools, which is a great point. So they had asked me, how do we go around that? How do we get around that? And I said, well, do y'all have a parent group that meets and focuses on advocacy when these things pop up? And they didn't. And I said, it starts with there's a famous quote by Margaret Mead, a small group of concerned citizens change the world. In fact, that's the only group that ever has. So it starts with a small group. So I did share that with her, and she said, we're going to have to get more involved. But I think part of the challenge is, and I'm not sure if you've got kids or people have kids here, but before I had kids, I was completely unaware of the policies around education in the schools. But once you have a child, you start thinking more seriously about their future, and you start becoming more invested. So these parents were becoming more invested, but I feel like they were playing catch up, so to speak. So,
yeah, I that's an interesting piece of that. That tension that folks are feeling is how do you get folks that don't feel there's something in it for them if they opt in, and it's hard to tell the story too of as you were indicating earlier how many upstream benefits there are of good education. I certainly feel that for myself of being able to go through a public education system in Montana that prepared me, sent me off to college, and knowing that really that's hard to connect for a lot of us. That when a good school system is a good public safety investment, that's getting kids on successful trajectories to stay out of crime, drugs, alcohol, violence, et cetera, which is a benefit to everyone, even if we don't have a kid.
Right, and the nexus between that, Joey, between education and housing is, for example, when you've got teacher shortages, and it's my understanding, I just actually met with Superintendent Bertram from Bozeman a week ago and asked about shortages. I guess in 21 and 22, y'all saw a big influx of people coming in. That's when, things were kind of busting at the seams from an affordable housing perspective, teacher shortages. That has slowly plateaued and it's in a much better place now. But I did ask, I said, are you having challenges with finding teachers and teacher retention if they can't live where they work? So if a teacher works at Emily Dickinson downtown and she's got to drive in from Manhattan every day, that's a tough drive. He said things have gotten better, but there's still significant challenges. So I think when we talk about affordable housing and education, it'd be remiss if we didn't mention the teacher piece. And talking about teacher retention, when you've got a child that goes to school and the teachers, it's his first year, teaching is a very difficult profession, and it takes 3 to 4 years for a teacher to really, he or she to really get their groove. But if a teacher leaves after a year or two, it does a disservice to the kids too, because the kids is going to be reflective of that teacher's experience, the teacher's ability to manage that classroom. So turnover and the ability for a teacher to remain in her community or his community is very important. So,
Yeah, I think that, so often when we're talking about who's the housing for,
right,
that we're trying to fight for and get off the ground and get built, we throw around all of the, essential professions that keep a community running, safe, prosperous, which is, direct service workers, service industry, retail,
Absolutely.
et cetera. That's, that makes people feel like this is a great place to live. But it's also, of course, nurses and firefighters. And teachers are often, for me personally, nearly the top of my list of fears because of this cascade that can happen when you can't, create a system of retaining good teachers and knowing the effects that has on kids in the community, et cetera, and knowing how hard it is. I mean, I have one of my roommates works in the school system here, and I'm like, wow, there is tough to see,
right,
like, what's the path to sustainability?
Yeah.
Just to even work, let alone if they want to have kids of their own.
And then potentially buy a house at some point, right? That additional stress. It's a tough uphill climb. So, and not to mention the teachers, but the other antecedent, in my opinion, is just the workforce in general. So I feel like as a business owner here, particularly if you're a business owner in downtown Bozeman, it's critical that you be able to maintain staffing levels and folks aren't having to drive in 40, 50 miles. So there's a direct impact on our local economy when X restaurant is only open 4 days a week because they don't have the staff to open the other 3 days a week. So the general community comes in and says, why are they open 4 days? Well, it's not because they don't want to, it's they don't have the staff. So I think it hits home to a lot of people at that point to understand that there are certainly cascading effects beyond the education piece that we talked about.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, we don't have to get too far into this of just, of course, the cascading pieces, that connects to our public health,
Exactly.
and more time on the road, more miles traveled, et cetera.
Absolutely.
But
you seem like you're an expert at this and have talked about this ad nauseum.
it's on our mind over here a lot. I think kind of our last question that I'm curious, your thoughts for our listeners. In your view, what should we be pursuing? What should this community be focusing on as solutions to our affordable housing challenges here?
Well, this is probably going to be somewhat unpopular. I was, chatting with staff prior to this, and let me just preface. I've been here 2 years, so I don't want to be that person that comes into a new place and say, "Why don't you do it like that?" But having said that, there are lessons learned when you go through this. Like I said, I was in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston saw a huge population increase in the early 2000s. We saw a big bump in 2020, just like you all did. But I do think Charleston has done some things well to control the affordable housing challenge, even though it's an immense mountain to climb. One of the things I asked, I think, was at two things I asked at the coalition meeting, and people turned around and looked at me like I was from Mars. Was tell me about the state sales tax challenge here, and why don't we have a state sales tax? From an outside perspective, that looks a bit odd because before I moved here, I was a tourist in this town for 20-some years. I used your waterways, I used your roads, I skied on your hills, I ate at your restaurants, and I didn't pay a dime for that impact for the 20 years I was here. So one of the things I think we ought to think about is not necessarily a sales tax, but the state legislature ought to give more flexibility to cities and municipalities to figure out how to solve this problem locally. Home rule and locally figuring it out at the local level, to me, is an issue and is an example that should resonate with either political party here in the state. And I'm just curious why that doesn't. Why doesn't Bozeman or Belgrade have the authority to assess a fee or a tax on some of the local tourists to basically help support an affordable housing fund? So that'd be the first thing I'd think about. The other piece that I think is when people often think of affordable housing, they often think about like low income housing. So as we talked about earlier in this conversation, our lane at Habitat is 70 to 8% AMI. It's folks that are hardworking, making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 annually, want to buy a house and create generational wealth. That's kind of our mission. So, and I think you're aware of this. We got to work on the supply side. We got to build more homes, duplexes, townhomes, accessory dwellings. But for Habitat, it's really home ownership. It's not just rentals. Right. I think rentals are important part of the equation, but I think home ownership is critically important because that builds generational wealth. That builds the opportunity for that person to sell that home 15, 20 years down and reap the benefits of the market. Second, I think we need to figure out how to build houses faster and streamline that permitting process for builders that want to come in and build affordable homes and build them right. Third, we have to lean into our private partners. So the public-private partnerships are critical. Good examples, we're building our homes out in Belgrade. We're doing these 8 homes over the next couple of years. That required some creative financing, creative conversations with our developer, creative conversations with our contractor, creative conversations with our materials folks. So all along the line, folks, and the way I looked at this is I asked them for a 10 or 15% reduction in their normal cost. If you can do that across 5, 6, 7 key players in the equation, we can get a house that would cost $500,000 or $600,000 to build down to $300,000. And that's an affordable house for many in Bozeman. Not everybody, but many in Bozeman to achieve that dream of home ownership. And the last piece is organizations like ours and others, it's preserving that long-term affordability, not just for the short term, but over the 20, 30 years, so that home remains in perpetuity affordable for the next generation that comes through. And that's for us, that's kind of what we're focused on. I think that answers your question, but I really do feel like the cities need to have more flexibility around trying to solve this issue and creating a housing fund. So I'm not sure your take on that or your feeling has been, Mayor. And so I'm guessing you get some of the practical reasons why that wouldn't happen or would happen, but I'm curious your take.
Yeah, I mean, one is a quick piece of that is that there is some Montana pride of not having a sales tax. There is something very real about that we feel it's special that we don't have one. And at the same time, I think folks grapple with, especially in growing cities like Bozeman or those that have a lot of tourists come through, where we know, the big slice of the bed tax for hotel stays comes out of this community, comes out of this valley, and it doesn't necessarily come back to solve, the growing pains, the tension that comes with, folks discovering Montana, discovering Bozeman through shows like Yellowstone or otherwise. And so I think I'm seeing more people grapple with that contradiction of there are things that are making this community harder to live in, harder to solve the problems because our ability to use money and to raise money to solve it is limited. And at the same time, a lot of tourists, what was it, 13 or 14 million over the last couple of years? So 13 or 14 tourists for every one Montanan that we subsidize to use our roads, to use our waters. I think more folks are grappling with that contradiction of the pride of we don't do this, sales taxes are regressive, et cetera, all of those pieces but man, then it's just going to continue, the burden is just going to continue to fall on existing commercial and residential property taxpayers, which is also untenable.
And you make a great point that, there is a cultural, true north for folks here regarding the sales tax. But, I came from a very conservative state. But one of the big challenges there that I see different than here is the state legislature basically really believed very strongly about home rule and giving cities the ability. So when I say sales tax, that could also mean a small fee that folks are paying here locally. So I guess what all I'm saying is I don't want folks to react to the sales tax in a negative way. I just think that cities across the state should have more flexibility to determine and figure out how to solve the problem and solve the challenge within their own community. Yeah, if that's an additional fee or tax, call it what you will. But I think it's doing a disservice to us in our community when you've got folks from all over the country, all over the world, visiting this place, this special place, and using our resources and not having to pay a dime for it. So,
yeah, I appreciate your kind of reframing that, because I think the North Star for anyone in the housing space in Montana that's trying to look at a new source of revenue that's not just putting more burden on current property taxpayers. Yeah, it's not a sales tax per se. It's that's the stand-in for something that we can use locally, that we have control over, that we get to say we're not going to continue asking the same burdened tax base to pay for these challenges that they're not necessarily culpable for.
And I think you might get the same response I got from those Belgrade parents, which was the literature that I read for our home, we'd be paying like $6 or $10 more a year. So as a parent with 2 or 3 children in the public school system, a $10 investment in your public schools, they felt was not only well worth it, but they were confounded that it didn't pass. So it's, and I guess the argument could be it's $10 here, $10 there, and eventually it's hundreds of dollars. But a $10 investment in a home, an extra additional on your property tax to pay for, or the levy to pay for, making sure that teachers are paid well, making sure you have the infrastructure in place to build new buildings if you need to build new buildings, seems like a worthy investment. So,
yeah. You said it. You said it. Well, Jason, I really appreciate you making the time for us today. We had truly, it was a pleasure. I mean, we meandered a lot. We covered, sort of some of the kind of the nebulous parts of why Montana is the way it is in some ways, but also
that conversation.
Listen,
it was fun. I still consider myself an outsider. I've only been here 2 years. I want to make sure that I'm being reverent and admiring the culture that I've walked into. I just don't know from dealing with this, seeing this record play out in other places, that there are some things that we should at least talk about. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate the conversation today too.
Yeah, and I appreciate I welcome you coming in as a lifelong Montanan. I think it's sometimes tough. Like we sometimes over self-exceptionalize Montana or Bozeman. We say, "Oh, that works over there. It would never work here." And we can translate things. We can try to shift them. We can crunch them down. We can dent them up a little bit to make it work and feel like something that's in.
And this is probably why you were elected mayor, is because in today's politics, if you're unable to compromise and be able to be flexible and think about things in a different way, then you really shouldn't be in politics. So I appreciate that outlook and insight. It's very helpful.
Well, thank you again for for joining us today, for hopping on the show, and thank you to our listeners, and we will catch you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Bozeman Beat. If you enjoy listening to this show, please help us out by sharing this episode with a friend or rating and reviewing our show on whichever podcast app you use. If you have feedback, questions, or suggestion for a future topic you'd like to hear us discuss, please email us at podcast@bozemanmt.gov. That's podcast@bozemanmt, as in Montana.gov. Hope to see you in the next episode.